Well, good morning, and thanks to all of you for joining us. It's a real pleasure this morning to introduce our featured speaker, Michael Mandelbaum. Michael is Professor Emeritus of Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and is a former Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of the recently published book, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, which is just one of the prodigious, in my opinion, total of 16 books he has written over the years on the subject of foreign policy. Among his many titles are Mission Failure, America and the World in the Post-Cold War Era, This Used to Be Us, which he co-authored with Tom Friedman, and The Rise and the Fall of Peace on Earth. I've had the great pleasure of reading The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, and I strongly recommend it as a comprehensive, panoramic view of almost 260 years of our relations with the rest of the world in times of both peace and war. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us this morning to share your thoughts on the fascinating and challenging topic of American foreign policy. And now I will turn the podium over to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler, and thank you all for joining this session. My new book, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, Weak Power, Great Power, Superpower, Hyperpower, covers 250 years of the history of American foreign policy from 1765 to 2015. And the book has three purposes. The first purpose is simply to tell the story, to describe, but also to analyze the major events and the leading personalities in American foreign policy over these 2.5 centuries. The leading personalities are almost all American presidents, but not exclusively so. Other important foreign policy makers find their way into the pages of this book. The second purpose of the Four Ages of American Foreign Policy is to address the major controversies in the history of America's relations with the rest of the world. So I deal with such questions as, why did the 13 colonies rebel against the British Empire at the end of the 18th century? Why did the Cold War begin, and why did it end as it did? Which presidents were successful and which unsuccessful in the conduct of foreign policy? Spoiler alert, Thomas Jefferson does not come out well. The third purpose of the Four Ages of American foreign policy is to draw out the themes that run through all 250 years. What are those themes? Well, the history of American foreign policy, like the history of everything else, exhibits both continuity and change. And it is on the principal continuities and the major changes in the history of American foreign policy that the Four Ages of American foreign policy is based. Let me say something about both continuities and changes, beginning with the continuities. There are, as I write in the book, three principal continuities. Throughout its history, American foreign policy has been, especially in comparison with the foreign policies of other countries, unusually ideological, unusually economic, and unusually democratic. What do I mean by that? Well, by unusually ideological, I mean that the United States, more than other countries, has sought to promote its own political values beyond its borders. In particular, democracy within countries, and peace among them. Now, to be sure, the United States is not the only country ever to have done this. Great Britain in the 19th century devoted itself in part in its foreign relations to promoting its political values. And since the end of World War II, Western Europe, now in the form of the European Union, has done something similar. It has been dedicated to promoting democratic values beyond its borders. Nor is the promotion of American values the only approach to foreign policy that the United States has adopted. In fact, throughout its history, and especially since the beginning of the 20th century, the United States has followed two distinct courses in foreign policy, each of them identified with a particular early 20th century president. The first of these approaches is sometimes called realism. It emphasizes power and the defense of America's interests. It seeks to promote a stable balance of power in the world. The early 20th century president with whom this approach is most closely identified, and whom I discuss in the book, was and is Theodore Roosevelt, who devoted a considerable part of his presidency to trying to contrive a stable balance of power in East Asia. The second alternative approach is the one that emphasizes value promotion. It is identified with Theodore Roosevelt's political rival, Woodrow Wilson, who also features in The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy. Wilson sought to contrive not a balance of power, but a community of power, working through the international organization that he helped to found in the wake of World War I, the League of Nations, but that the United States, despite his efforts, did not join. In its history, the United States, like most countries in most places, in most of history, has favored, has opted for, has given priority to the realist approach. Most of American foreign policy has been devoted to the protection of American interests. But the alternative approach, the Wilsonian approach, the effort to promote American values abroad, has been a part of the American foreign policy agenda really since the beginning of the Republic, and especially since World War I. It has never gone away. It has always been a factor in the making and the conduct of foreign policy. And its relative importance is one of the things that has made American foreign policy distinctively American. The second continuity in the history of American foreign policy, as I've mentioned, and as I note in The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, is that the United States has conducted an unusually economic foreign policy. By that, I mean that the United States has consistently sought to use economic interests to achieve political goals beyond its borders. This goes back all the way to before the founding of the United States. As we all remember, one of the reasons for the American Revolution was the imposition by the British Parliament on the 13 colonies of taxes that the colonials felt were unjust and unwarranted. One of the first steps that they took against those taxes was to organize a boycott of imported British goods. The idea was to put pressure on the British merchants selling those goods, to put pressure in turn on the British Parliament to rescind the taxes. And this tactic had a bit of successes. So the use of economic sanctions is older than the American Republic, and it has had, at least on a few occasions, a modicum of success. Until the 20th century, trade was the favored economic instrument of foreign policy on the part of the United States. But beginning in the 20th century, and specifically beginning with what was called dollar diplomacy in the presidency of William Howard Taft, which, as you'll recall, came between the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, the United States tried to use the export of capital as well as trade as an instrument for achieving political goals beyond America's borders. Third, the United States has conducted an unusually democratic foreign policy. By that, I mean that the American public has had, compared with other countries, an unusually large role in the formation and the implementation of foreign policy. In Europe, in the great powers, classically, foreign policy was the preserve of the monarchy and the aristocracy. The United States, of course, had neither, and that left room for the public to exercise its influence, which it has done consistently. Public influence, the most important manifestation of the democratic feature of American foreign policy, has been strikingly evident in America's wars. Public opinion has helped both to start and to stop American wars. There is a recurrent pattern in American history in which an event occurs, a dramatic event, usually outside America's borders, but sometimes within the United States, that shocks Americans, that makes the world suddenly seem more dangerous, and that galvanizes the public to demand a more robust foreign policy, which has often involved the use of force. For example, in 1898, the sinking of the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor had an impact on American public opinion that created a demand, or at least support, for the Spanish-American War of that year. Fewer than 2 decades later, as I note in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, the German sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania during World War I, a war in which the United States was not participating and that most Americans felt did not involve them, transformed the American public image of Germany for the worse and paved the way for the United States to enter World War I against Germany 2 years later. The Japanese attack on American naval forces at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941, paved the way for the immediate American entry into that war. Formal entry, I should say, because as I note in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy on the chapter devoted to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the United States was already participating in the war in important ways. And finally, we all remember the attacks of September 11th, 2001, 21 years and 1 day ago, which led to American participation in 2 wars, in Afghanistan and in Iraq. But public opinion has also stopped American wars. The American war in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan all became unpopular with the public. And their unpopularity eventually forced the American government to withdraw American troops from those countries. Once again, the democratic element, the democratic feature of American foreign policy had a profound impact. I should note that in all 3 cases, the American public turned against the war not because it decided that the goals for which the United States was fighting were unworthy or not valuable. In each case, the public turned against the war rather because it concluded that the price of pursuing those worthy goals had become too high. It's worth noting here, I think, that every American war, without exception, has provoked dissent and protest. War protest is as American as apple pie, although the protest has taken different forms for different wars. For example, in the Revolutionary War, those in the 13 colonies who objected to making war against the British Empire reacted simply by leaving, by moving to Canada. And there were tens of thousands of them. In World War II, to take another example, the most strenuous protest against formal American involvement in the war occurred before the United States formally entered the conflict, through the efforts, among others, of the America First movement. After Pearl Harbor, opposition and the American First movement disintegrated. It's also worth noting that American foreign policy is particularly democratic because there are multiple avenues through which the public can influence the making and the conduct of foreign policy. The White House and the presidency have been, since the last century, the center of foreign policy making, but it's also possible to exert influence through the great departments of the federal government, the departments of state, treasury, and defense. And it's also the case that the Congress has a role in foreign policy and is also subject to public influence. Finally, it should be noted that the impact of public opinion on foreign policy is not readily predictable and therefore has caused American foreign policy, at least in the eyes of some, especially America's foreign adversaries, to be unpredictable. The Japanese government did not expect the vigor of the American response to the attacks on Pearl Harbor. Or, to take another example, Saddam Hussein certainly did not expect, when he invaded and occupied neighboring Kuwait in 1990, that the United States would organize a global coalition, send a force of 250,000 American troops, and summarily evict his forces from Kuwait in 1991. Well, those are the principal continuities of American foreign policy. What are the changes? By far, the most important change that I trace in the 4 ages of American foreign policy is the change in America's relative power in the world. And remember that for purposes of foreign policy, power is relative. What matters is how much power the United States has in relationship to other countries. That power has steadily expanded over 250 years. And in expanding, it has led to 4 different international roles for the United States, which are reflected in the subtitle of the 4 ages of American foreign policy. From 1765 to 1865, the United States was a weak power, concerned to defend its independence while engaging in its national project of expanding across North America. From 1865 to 1945, the United States acted as one of several great powers in the international system, and it did what great powers characteristically do. It cooperated, but also competed with other great powers, and it carved out a sphere of influence for itself, that sphere of influence encompassing Central America and the eastern part of the Pacific Ocean. During this period, the United States became a formal imperial power. But compared with the great empires of the European powers, and indeed the great empire of Japan in the 20th century, the American empire was small, belated, half-hearted, and really had almost no impact on the life of the nation. Once Americans had taken possession of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War, they couldn't wait to get rid of it, and did so finally in 1946. Well, the third age of American foreign policy ran from 1945 to 1990, during which time the United States was one of two global superpowers and competed in political, military, and economic terms around the world with the rival superpower, the Soviet Union. And emerging from the period in which it was a superpower, the United States became, between 1945 and 1990, what I call a hyperpower. That term comes from the French foreign minister, Hubert Védrine, who called the United States an hyperpuissance. Note that victorious wars have been involved in the transition from one period, one age, one role to the next. It was the American victory over the British Empire in what we call the Revolutionary War that made the United States an independent country and able to conduct an independent foreign policy. The outcome of the Civil War paved the way for the American emergence as a great power. American participation in the victorious coalition in World War II enabled it to become one of two rival superpowers, and the leading American role in the anti-communist, anti-Soviet coalition during the Cold War led to America's status in the fourth age of American foreign policy as a hyperpower. War has been important in American foreign policy. By my count, the country has fought 12 significant wars and countless other skirmishes. And yet, I don't think it's fair to call the United States a warlike country. Certainly, in almost every one of these wars, Americans believed that they were fighting for defensive purposes. Now, other countries have not always seen things that way, but I think for most of these wars, the American case for a defensive motivation is a pretty good one, or at least a defensible one. The great exception to this rule is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which was a war of territorial conquest and brought into the United States territories that now comprise much of the American Southwest and West. Another important point about America's wars is that in its three most important wars, it has had the benefit of unusually good commanders-in-chief. In the Revolutionary War, George Washington proved to be an effective battlefield tactician, and his most effective tactic was avoiding pitched battles with the superior British forces. But he also served as an inspirational example, not just for the soldiers of the Continental Army, but of the civilians of the 13 colonies who rallied around him. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln understood what was required for victory. And what was required was the destruction of the Confederate Army. He finally found a general capable of carrying out the strategy that was required, Ulysses S. Grant, and he persevered in the effort despite heavy costs until victory was secured. In World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to make a series of difficult strategic choices. And the choices he made were controversial at the time, and have remained controversial ever since. But as I argue in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, the choices that he made turned out to be the right ones. Between the fall of France in May of 1940 and America's formal entry into World War II in December 1941, Roosevelt gave as much assistance as he could to Great Britain to enable it to hold out against Nazi Germany. And when, on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Roosevelt promptly sent as much assistance, civilian and military, to the Soviet Union as well, despite the fact that there were serious reservations and indeed objections to his doing so in the United States. When the United States formally entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Roosevelt chose what came to be called a Europe First strategy. That is, he chose to put the emphasis of American military efforts in Europe rather than in Asia, despite the fact that the attack against the United States had come from Asia and was undertaken by an Asian power, Japan. Roosevelt decided that the initial operation of the American Army in World War II should be the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. This was called Operation Torch. His generals objected that this was a distraction from the main business of striking directly at Germany, but Roosevelt decided that the American public had to see its army in action in the calendar year 1942 in order to maintain public support for the war. Finally, Roosevelt decided that the main American military operation in the war, the American British Canadian cross-channel invasion of France should take place in the spring of 1944. And indeed, D-Day, as it came to be called, took place not in May, which was the original date, but rather on June 6, 1944. In setting this date, he resisted the insistence of one of his main allies, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, that this operation take place earlier, but he also resisted the wishes of his other main ally, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain, that this operation be postponed, perhaps indefinitely. It's finally worth noting about all 3 commanders-in-chief that each of them was very good at what is the main task of any American commander-in-chief during wartime, and which is often the most difficult of the commander-in-chief's tasks. That is, keeping the American public committed to the fighting. In conclusion, let me say a brief word about the recent past and the present and future. It's noteworthy, I think, that in the first 3 ages of its foreign policy, the United States was notably successful. During its period as a weak power, it successfully maintained its independence. During its era as a great power, it took part in the 2 victorious coalitions in the 2 world wars. During the age of the American superpower, the United States led a coalition that prevailed in the Cold War. But the 4th age of American foreign policy, as I detail in my book, is a different story. In this era, American foreign policy did not meet with success, which leads to one of the paradoxes that I note in the 4 ages of American foreign policy. That is, American foreign policy has been least successful when American relative power in the world has been at its height. What's the reason for this? Well, the American government made some mistakes in foreign policy during this period, and I address these mistakes. One of them, one that I consider a mistake, is the decision to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization eastward toward Russia, despite Russian objections and despite promises to the Russians that this would not happen, at a time, the mid-1990s, when Russia was led by a democratically inclined president who wanted to be part of the West. In this way, of course, Boris Yeltsin stands in sharp contrast to Russia's current president, Vladimir Putin. The major reason for America's failure in the fourth age of American foreign policy, however, is the general project that preoccupied the nation's relations with other countries. During this period, America sought to promote and even to install in different countries around the world a particular kind of government, our kind of government. The United States sought both indirectly and in some cases directly to make available to these countries a democratic government, one that conducts free and fair election, protects individual rights, fosters prosperity, and remains at peace with its neighbors and the rest of the world. It's a good idea, but unfortunately, it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is that this kind of government, our kind of government, a democratic, prosperity fostering, rights protecting, peace loving government, requires certain preconditions. It requires a particular set of values. It requires a particular set of institutions. It requires a particular kind of national experience. And unfortunately, not every country has these preconditions. Now, that doesn't mean that this kind of government is impossible in all such countries, but it is the case that such a form of government cannot be imposed from the outside. It must have indigenous roots, and it cannot be created overnight. It takes decades, generations to put the preconditions in place. So America failed in its era of hyperpower, and it failed, to put it most bluntly, because during this era, it undertook what was mission impossible. Well, what about the present and the future? We are now in the fifth era, the fifth age of American foreign policy. Its contours are just coming into focus, and prediction being impossible now, as always, we can't say just what it will look like. But about the future of this fifth era of American foreign policy, we can say three things with some certainty. First, this era will be in part determined by America's relative power in the world. Second, it will be determined, at least as far as the United States is concerned, by America's characteristic ideological, economic, and democratic approach to the world. And third, and finally, American foreign policy in this fifth, as yet unnamed era of American foreign policy will be determined, as foreign policy and history always are, by the unpredictable contingencies of human history. Thank you. Before Tyler comes on, let me add one point. I write a foreign policy essay monthly. I distribute it free to anybody who is interested. If you wish to be on my mailing list, send me your email at the following email address: American Foreign Policy, all one word, @jhu.edu. That's American Foreign Policy at jhu.edu, and I'll be happy to put you on my distribution list. Tyler, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for a very thorough summary of a very comprehensive book. Let me tell you, if you read it, if most of you get the chance, you will find that the details involved in the book are mind-boggling. So, and also very entertaining, to say the least. Well, let me start with the first question. And given recent world events, of which we're all, I'm afraid, painfully aware, it looks like we are headed, we, the West and the US in particular, for a period of superpower antagonism, if I can use that term. And we all know the key players involved. What do you think the chances are that this antagonism can be moderated over time to at least limit the risk of open conflict, whether it happens in Europe or Taiwan or elsewhere? In other words, how can diplomacy and intelligent foreign policy bail us out of what looks like a very unpleasant three-part conflict between China, the US, and Russia?
Thank you. As it happens, I've written about the origins of this new era of foreign policy and the emergence of three serious rivals to the United States in my previous book, which is called The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, where I write about Russia, China, and Iran, America's three most serious rivals. I should say that this era of American foreign policy bears some resemblance to the Cold War in that there is strategic competition, which has a military dimension, but it differs from the Cold War in several important ways. First, America at this point faces three regional rivals rather than one global rival. Second, during the Cold War, the United States had virtually no economic contact with the Soviet Union, whereas Russia to some extent and China to a very great extent are integrated into the global economy, which vastly complicates our rivalry with them. And third, the Cold War was an ideological contest. The Soviet Union had a fully formed economic and political system that it sought to implant around the world. That is not true to anything like the same extent of America's three rivals. I do think that the fact of nuclear weapons will play a role in deterring overt conflict with these three rivals, as it did during the Cold War. And the United States is certainly in diplomatic contact, certainly with China, and I think will be with Russia. So we can hope that diplomacy will prevent a terrible conflict from occurring. I might say also that the fact that Russia has done so poorly in its invasion of Ukraine, and particularly poorly in comparison with what clearly was Mr. Putin's expectation of a quick and easy and cheap victory, will help to deter China over the issue of Taiwan, will, one hopes, help to prevent Russia from launching other incursions, and might even have some impact on Iran. That said, let me add one final point. I think the most dangerous country, in some ways the most dangerous or most urgently dangerous of the three, is Iran, because Iran is the most aggressive of the three. It's the most ideological of the three. It does have an ideology in whose grip the leadership is and on behalf of which it acts. And Iran is seeking nuclear weapons, which, if it obtains nuclear weapons, will make it even more aggressive. And if it does get nuclear weapons, that, I fear, will lead to the spread of nuclear weapons, not only in the region, but perhaps around the world. It will lead to what specialists call a nuclear cascade. So the United States has a very, very powerful interest in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. I fear that even if there is another agreement with Iran, that will not suffice. And so I think it behooves the United States seriously to contemplate the use of force to make sure that Iran doesn't obtain a nuclear weapon and open a Pandora's box to problems and even perhaps terrors that we can barely imagine.
And it would, more on that subject, it would seem the Israelis are obviously very, very focused on the issue. And it would strike me that the probability is they would, in fact, perhaps be the first player to launch a physical attack on Iran's nuclear capability, assuming the JCPOA falls apart and nothing happens. So would you agree with that? That they would do it?
I would agree that the Israelis are ready, willing, and able to do whatever is needed to prevent an Iranian bomb. And that, incidentally, is why the countries of the Gulf, formally through the Abraham Accords and informally with burgeoning Saudi-Israeli relations, although lacking for the moment formal diplomatic ties. That is why the Arab countries of the Gulf have moved sharply closer to Israel, because they see Israel as their potential protector, and I'm afraid have lost confidence in the United States. But it is the case that although Israel is ingenious and has studied this problem for years, the Israelis don't have anything like the military capability that the United States has. And I should add that certainly for the United States, a so-called kinetic undertaking to stop the Iranian nuclear program would not involve American troops on the ground. It would involve merely, or one can't say merely, but it would involve air and naval power, which the United States has to a far greater extent, not just than Israel, but than any country in the world, and which is therefore much more capable of solving the problem than are the comparable Israeli forces.
Okay, we have a question from the audience here, which pushes us back a few hundred years. Can you expand on your Thomas Jefferson comment and include your feeling about his Louisiana Purchase?
Well, the Louisiana Purchase was his great achievement, and it made a huge difference to the country. It was the first major expansion of the country, and for that, his picture, or his profile, I should say, is out on Mount Rushmore. It should be noted that in obtaining the Louisiana Purchase and in bludgeoning it through Congress, Jefferson violated all of his loudly proclaimed precepts about the limitations of government and federal and presidential power. Nonetheless, in retrospect, I think almost all of us are glad that it happened. But Jefferson misfired in his relations with Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. The British were fighting for their lives against France. They used their naval superiority as their main instrument against France, and they enforced a blockade against France, which involved stopping all shipping that was carrying French goods or heading for French ports, including American shipping. So this angered the Americans, needless to say. There was a negotiation between American representatives and the British to try to come to some accommodation. There had already been a previous negotiation in which an agreement had been achieved, the so-called Jay's Treaty under George Washington's aegis, which managed to calm down relations between the two. But Jefferson sent representatives again to Britain. They brought back another treaty, and he refused it, saying it didn't fulfill all of his conditions, and therefore he wouldn't accept it. He therefore decided, in order to punish the British, to impose an embargo on American trade. He refused to allow Americans to trade with any country. The so-called Jefferson embargo was a disaster. It inflicted, according to one source that I read, more harm proportionately on the American economy than did the Great Depression. It drove the New England states, which depended especially on overseas trade, into near mutiny. Had it continued, there could have been secession from the Union by the New England states. And so he was finally forced to end the embargo, which was one of the most misbegotten foreign policy initiatives the United States had ever taken. His successor, James Madison, however, was left with the problem of what to do about the British and their stopping of American ships and sometimes seizing British sailors on American ships who were British, whom they claimed had deserted from British ships, and in some cases they had. Madison couldn't think of anything to do, so he went to war, and that thus began the War of 1812, which was itself, in my judgment, and I've written an article saying this, but also said so in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, the most misbegotten war in American history. The United States suffered some considerable losses. The British invaded North America and burned the city of Washington. In return, and in the end, the United States achieved nothing. In fact, the British made concessions before the war began that satisfied most of Madison's demands, but this being the early 19th century, word didn't reach the United States until after the war had begun. So the United States fought a dangerous war with high costs and got nothing. And that was due ultimately to Jefferson's policy toward the British in the Napoleonic Wars. That's why I do not rank him highly as a foreign policymaker.
Well, looking further at that issue of, shall we say, occasional presidential dysfunction, it brings up my observation, if I can steal a question in between here. You don't hesitate in the book to take swipes at several presidents, Roosevelt, Wilson, Obama, and potentially Biden, perhaps. Could you give us a little color on your thoughts about Roosevelt's, for example, dysfunction in terms of his organization, his tendency to befuddle his staff and not make clear his intentions, and so forth and so on? Not to mention his failure or his assumption that he could charm Joseph Stalin at Yalta, and of course, that didn't work. And of course, there are other issues with Wilson and other presidents as well. So I know it's a lengthy question, but your thoughts would be appreciated.
Sure. Franklin Roosevelt was, in my mind, a great president because he was a great commander-in-chief. So he was a great foreign policy president because, as I said, he made the right decisions. But he did have foibles, malfunctions. He was a notoriously disorganized administrator, and deliberately so. Henry Stimson, who served in many administrations and served as the Secretary of War, said he was the worst administrator he ever served under. He had a habit of telling different things to different people, and he did it, and again, this is hardly original with me, lots of people have written about this. He did it in part to control people, to keep his options open. And he did, but despite, or who knows, because of those malfunctions, because of that, shall we say, euphemistically eccentric way of conducting his office, he managed to pass the New Deal and basically win the war. So although he was maddening to work for, he did his job very well. As for Wilson, his problem was that he was a very bad politician when it came to the League of Nations. He refused any compromise in presenting the League to the Senate. even though had he been willing to compromise, he could have gotten it passed. It's never been clear, and it never will be clear, to what extent, if any, the stroke that he suffered in 1919 while barnstorming for the League in the West affected his judgment. And of course, in the end, he really wasn't able to discharge the office at all. His wife was the effective president by relaying his commands from his sickbed. Roosevelt, in particular, would not answer the most important part of the League debate, and that was the United States obligated to go to war, whether or not the Congress declared war, if the League voted to go to war? Because the League of Nations Charter suggested that that was the case, but of course it contradicted the Constitution. The Senate tried to get an answer from Wilson to that crucial question, and he said the United States had a moral but not a legal obligation, which didn't clarify matters, and that did not help his cause. So had he been willing to make some compromises, the United States would have joined the League. I should add that the issue of whether the United States was obliged to go to war by the League Charter is a manifestation of a larger question that hovers over international organizations, and that is, will major member countries give up their sovereignty in belonging to international organizations? In the European Union, to some extent, they do. That is, they've given up monetary sovereignty, those that belong to the euro, which is now exercised by a European central bank. But the United States has never been willing to give up sovereignty, and that is why the United States has a veto in the United Nations Security Council, as do the other permanent members. So what I say about Woodrow Wilson is that he was important not for what he accomplished, but for his ideas, which were not put into practice, but have persisted ever since, have been increasingly influential ever since, and live on, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well.
Okay, we have a question about our ties with Latin America. How did America's policy of extending loans to South America and leaving them literally indebted to America square with its ideological and democratic values?
Well, two things. American loans to Central America under Taft's dollar diplomacy were also conveyed to China. And the hope was, and these were America encouraging private loans. In those days, the government didn't make loans. That was also true when the United States tried to fix the German reparations issue in the 1920s. It encouraged banks to lend to Germany, but didn't lend itself. But that strategy did not work very well. Other countries, as a result of dollar diplomacy, did not adopt the political practices that the United States favored, especially China. Since World War II, increasingly, the United States has attempted to influence the politics of other countries through the offices of the International Monetary Fund, which gives loans to countries in distress, but which is a body in which the United States exercises considerable influence. And the United States has had modest success there. In the 1990s, for example, Indonesia experienced a financial crisis. The United States was instrumental in getting the IMF to provide loans. One of the conditions was that the IMF that Indonesia adopt a more democratic foreign policy, and it did. And to this day, it has free and fair elections, as it did not beforehand. So the American effort to use the export of capital has had an intermediary since World War II, namely the IMF, and it has, on the whole, not been particularly successful, but it has, on occasion, enjoyed modest success, as have trade sanctions.
Okay, and as we're looking at the moment south towards Latin America, do remind us how close we came to a virtual catastrophe in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I mean, it's just an incredible story of being close to the precipice and barely escaping a very, very devastating impact on the U.S.
Well, it certainly seems to be the closest the United States has come, closest the world has come to a nuclear disaster, and it's been carefully studied. And there have been a number of people on the Soviet side who have revealed what they knew. It's still not possible to give a definitive answer because we don't know what Kennedy would have decided had Khrushchev not decided to pull the missiles out. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that he would not have attacked immediately. He would have attempted to negotiate. Had the United States attacked, it's not clear what the Soviet side would have done, although there is some evidence that Soviet personnel on the island had authorization to use the nuclear weapons that had been sent there on their own, although it's not clear that they were fully operational. So we can't say for sure how close we came, but we can say, I think for sure, that we came too close for comfort.
We've got a question about NATO, obviously recently expanded, looking more powerful and a little bit intimidating, I guess, to Vladimir Putin. What are your thoughts on the future of NATO? Has it been expanded and fortified enough to be a significant counter to Vladimir Putin looking forward?
Well, as I said, I think Putin's, for him, unhappy experience in Ukraine may make him more cautious about attacking other countries. But we now know that he is willing to attack other countries. He probably is less willing to attack NATO countries because that activates the NATO guarantee in Article 5, which says that an attack on one country is an attack on all, which means that an attack on the Baltic countries, which are now part of NATO, namely Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, would count as an attack on the United States. I should say that I'm not sure that Americans themselves understand this. These countries are vulnerable to Russian military activity. They really could not be defended by non-nuclear means if the Russians launched an all-out attack. That means two things. First, that it is incumbent on NATO to beef up its non-nuclear presence in these three countries. And second, that the addition of Sweden and especially Finland may help. So I think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th of this year has administered a shock to the system and has made it look much more important than it did previously to beef up NATO. That said, it's not clear that one of NATO's principal shortcomings, that is the underperformance of the non-American NATO members in mustering military support, will change. There is a NATO goal that each country should devote at least 2% of its gross domestic product to defense spending. The United States far surpasses this. Very few countries, relatively few countries, certainly not the richest non-American NATO country, Germany, meet this standard.
Would you, in that regard, would you assume that if NATO hadn't expanded into Eastern Europe when it did, that Putin would have felt compelled to make his move in Ukraine?
No, my view is,
how would that have changed the dynamics there?
Well, my view is that although we certainly can't know this, it's plausible to argue that without NATO expansion, there would have been no invasion of Ukraine, and in fact, might conceivably have been no Putin. The reason being that the initial expansion of NATO, as I document in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy and in my previous book, Mission Failure, at some greater length, the initial expansion of NATO transformed the view of the Russian political elite and the Russian public of the United States and the West. Almost overnight, they became anti-American. Anti-Americanism became the default mode of Russian foreign policy. Not only that, but it became possible, as it was not before the expansion of NATO, for a Russian leader to fortify his domestic position by seeming to stand up to the United States and NATO. And that was the rationale for all of Putin's aggressive maneuvers before this year. In other words, without NATO expansion, he would not have had the rationale for the far more aggressive foreign policy that he carried out beginning in 2007. I argue in that book, in Mission Failure, I make allusion to this point in the 4 Ages. I wrote a whole book about it called The Dawn of Peace in Europe, that in fact, at the time of NATO expansion, we already had an alternative and better security system in place in Europe as a result of all of the political developments and the arms control agreements of the late Cold War, which gave us the best of both worlds, gave Eastern Europe security while at the same time reassuring Russia and allowing Russia to be part of a North Atlantic community. Had we built on that, had we extended and expanded and thickened ties to Russia, things I think, although I can't prove it, would have been very different. But things are what they are. We took the course we took, ill-advised, though I and others thought at the time and in retrospect. And now we have a problem with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and therefore I think giving forceful, maximal support to Ukraine to stop and, if possible, push back the Russian invasion of their country is the proper policy.
Okay, we have a question that's very much on the front burner for all of us. It's very simple. In your view, does the U.S. have a coherent, logical foreign policy with regard to Taiwan?
It's a very good question. I think the answer is up to a point. Note that this is complicated by the fact that successive American presidents have thought it advisable not to give a formal security guarantee to Taiwan. We certainly have an informal guarantee, but there is a certain amount of wiggle room. There is a certain amount of uncertainty. We could close that gap. We could give a security guarantee to Taiwan, which, by the way, they had until 1978, when we ended formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan and inaugurated formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. We could do that, but that has generally been regarded as too provocative toward the Chinese to be worth undertaking. Although I note that there are a number of people who now think that we should change our policy and offer such a guarantee. It's also worth noting that there are some who believe that the Taiwanese themselves are not doing enough, that they are not spending enough on defense, that they are not doing enough to prepare for total social mobilization in the event of a Chinese attack. So in answer to your question, I think that it would be a disaster for China to take over Taiwan. It would be a disaster for the Taiwanese. It would be a disaster for our alliance system, because all countries that depend for their security, at least in part, on an American security guarantee would begin to doubt that security guarantee. And incidentally, the alternative to an American security guarantee is a country getting its own nuclear weapons. So that could lead to a nuclear cascade in East Asia. And it would also be unfortunate for the world because it would show that aggression pays. It would perhaps whet China's appetite for further aggression. It would perhaps encourage the Chinese to try to evict the United States Navy militarily from the Western Pacific. So for all these reasons, we have an interest in an independent democratic Taiwan. Just what the optimal strategy is for securing that interest, and in particular, whether the United States should now give an explicit security guarantee to the Republic of China on Taiwan, I'm not sure.
Okay, here's another question, more in the economic sphere. Don't you feel the inability of America to resolve its growing economic inequality makes other countries trend away from our democracy and look for solutions in autocratic and populist countries?
Several points. First, I don't think countries particularly look to the United States to decide what their domestic political arrangements ought to be. I do think that democracy does have a demonstration effect. It does affect other countries. I wrote a book on this subject several years ago called Democracy's Good Name: The Rise and Risks of the World's Most Popular Form of Government. But people abroad don't wake up one day and say, you know, America has too much economic inequality. Let's not have a democracy. That said, to the extent that the United States is successful and to the extent that it's politically coherent, it will be a more effective presence in the international arena. So American domestic politics does affect American foreign policy. And to the extent that the United States suffers from whatever pathologies at home that divide us, that focus our attention inward, that make foreign policy seem a luxury rather than a necessity, to that extent, the American role in the world is injured and diminished. I note that Mal has a question. Mal, do you want to ask the question?
Well, I want to ask lots of questions, but I think we've gotten an awful lot of insight, an awful lot of education from your presentation and discussion this morning. They used to say on television, we're running out of satellite time. And I promised our audience that we would conclude by quarter after, and I think we've done that. We could go on, I think, for quite a while, because there's a lot of stuff that everybody would like to understand. But I really want to offer many, many thanks to Michael Mandelbaum for his insightful and effective discussion today. It's not often we get to participate in such an overarching important foreign policy subject, and he did a great job at it. Thanks also to Tyler, to our team with Peter and Don, who helped put all this together. Our thanks to the library and the staff, Joan and her colleagues, for helping to support us. Remember that Professor Mandelbaum has offered us access to his monthly newsletter, and we'll be back shortly to see you all. Thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you, Mike. It was really terrific. Exceeded all of our expectations, and I thank you for that. Have a wonderful day. Everybody stay safe. Wear your masks. It's still time, even beyond Joan. It's important to do all those things. Okay. Thanks again.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Michael.
you, Tyler. Thank you,
And
Mal. And
remember that
again,
it's-
Michael, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
It's
Joan.
American Foreign Policy at jhu.edu, and thanks for joining.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you all. And I hope to see you at some of the programs at the library. Thank you
Yep.
all. Bye.